Hello and welcome to London College of Fashion. We're East Bank and I'm Mirren Kessling, cultural producer here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's event. This evening's In Conversation and Q&A will last 60 minutes, followed by the chance to visit the Making More Mischief exhibition. Oh, no worries. Is this better? It's very close. This evening's In Conversation event and Q&A will last 60 minutes, followed by the chance to visit the Making More Mischief exhibition. Thank you. Which will be open until 8:30 p.m. tonight. Simon Costin, co-curator of Making More Mischief folk costume exhibition and director of the Museum of British Folklore, is here with us tonight, and I'm going to introduce him and Andrew before they start tonight's In Conversation. Simon is an internationally respected art director and set designer, renowned for the conceptually ambitious nature of his editorial and catwalk designs. Born in London, he completed a BA in theatre design at Wimbledon School of Art. From Hermès to Lanvin, Costin has deep and diverse ties within the fashion industry, including an early 7-year collaboration with Alexander McQueen. He's also designed sets for photo shoots, collaborating with photographers like Tim Walker, Nick Knight, and fashion designers such as Charles Jeffrey, Maison Margiela, Erdem, and Moncler. Costin has both exhibited his own work within and curated shows at leading cultural centres. Yeah. Thank you. He has curated shows at leading cultural centres such as the ICA London and Metropolitan Museum of Art New York, and places off-grid like a forest in Argyll. In 2015, he received an honorary award from UAL as a Fellow in the Arts for his outstanding contribution to the creative industries. And he lives in Cornwall.
Sorry.
Andrew Teverson is Pro Vice-Chancellor and Head of London College of Fashion and Professor of Cultural History at the University of Arts London. He has published widely on the subjects of folklore, fairy tale, and contemporary fiction and culture. Publications include a critical edition, the selected children's fictions, fairy tales, and folk tales of Andrew Lang, the edited collection of Fairy Tale World, and a 2-volume critical edition of the scholarly writings of Andrew Lang. Andrew is Vice President Europe of the International Society of Folk Narrative Research and is on the advisory board for the Chichester Centre for Fairy Tales, Fantasy and Speculative Fiction. Please join me in giving them both a very warm welcome here tonight.
Thank you so much, Mirren, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here tonight with Simon and to be the one asking the questions. But welcome everyone to East Bank, and I hope you're enjoying our lovely new building. So we're here to talk about the current exhibition, Making More Mischief, also about the upcoming May Day rave, and perhaps we'll talk a bit about the significance of May Day as well. Let me start then by focusing on the current exhibition, which if you haven't seen it already, you'll have an opportunity afterwards to go and walk around and have a look at. And let me begin by asking about the journey to get here, Simon. So could you speak a little bit about how the exhibition came about? What were you aiming to achieve with it? What was your journey to East Bank?
Right. Settle in, because it's quite a long story. So basically, it kind of started when I was 7 years old and was taken on a holiday by my parents to Cornwall. And unbeknownst to me, it was May Day in Padstow. And we turned a corner. I was confronted by this enormous, careering, terrifying figure, which is the Os from Padstow's May Day. And it not only terrified me, but it actually was a moment of kind of true magic. You were witnessing a community who were expressing something that was deeply personal to them. And they were becoming something else. They were no longer the baker and the banker and the nurse and whatever it was. They were all committed to this event that they were participating in. And it really was magical for me at that point. And a few years later, my parents saw the Reader's Digest book, which some of you may know, the Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain, and this became my Bible, really. And whenever I wanted to learn more about folklore, British folklore and vernacular culture, there was nowhere in the UK that you can actually go to, no one place. So this project, and the reason we're sitting here now, was really born from that moment. And so roll on, the years roll on, I keep trying to find out more and more about it. I keep attending more and more events and seasonal customs. And then my friend Hilary Williams at Ditchling Museum said, why don't you just get off your backside and do something about it? So I thought, well, first of all, I need to find out whether I'm alone in my mania or if there are other people in the UK who would actually appreciate there being a museum of folklore. And how would that museum function? What would it be? Because folklore by its very nature is constantly mutating and changing, and it's not a fixed thing. And museums resist that, really. They like to pin something down, and that's it. But folklore doesn't allow you to do that. So I bought a little 1976 Castleton Tourer caravan on eBay, which I think there were pictures of at some point, and gutted it and made display cases inside and set off around the UK for 6 months. And the reaction was always the same wherever we pitched up, was why isn't there a museum of folklore in Britain? And I think the reason, there's lots of different reasons as to why there isn't one. I suspect museums operate from the top up generally, so they are the people with the knowledge and the expertise who are giving you, the lowly public, a view into their interpretation of these things, whereas a museum of folklore operates totally the opposite way. It's the people who have the material who are doing these things. So and I don't think that doesn't function very well within the museum fraternity because it's a complete unknown. So after 6 months of touring, I set about really approaching existing institutions to see whether they'd be interested to have an exhibition of folklore. And I had a personal collection of objects, and it's kind of grown from there. We've been I don't know what the word is, but doing exhibitions around the UK in different institutions with the end aim of actually having a museum at some point in the future. And the folk costume idea came about 10 years ago when it was pitched to a museum in London who remain nameless, who made us jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. And eventually we had mannequins and with the costumes on, photographs, and all the heads of department came in, and somebody gingerly fingered a hem on a garment and said, they're not very well made, are they? And at that moment, I realized that actually it was pointless. The meaning of these things was totally lost on them. So I still can't quite believe that we now have the folk costume exhibition that you're witnessing. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of why we're here.
Absolutely. When you started at the age 7, I thought I could just sit back for 40 minutes and listen. What's the criteria for entry for a kind of folk item? So what does a piece of clothing or a costume have to be in order to be classified as something that would be part of this exhibition?
That's tricky. The definitions are quite blurry by the very nature of what one group would define as folkloric. But generally speaking, we've taken the stand that a garment or an object that has been fashioned or embellished or put together by somebody who's untrained, so they're not a professional garment maker or a couturier or whatever, they've decorated and embellished something that exists or completely constructed the object. Maybe the Minehead Obios is a very good idea, a very good example. So it's the untrained eye that defines the folk element for me.
So it's kind of non-professional.
Yeah.
Is there something about, does it connect with the idea of an outsider art? Does it have that kind of...
I guess so, yeah.
Not authorised by the kind of official bodies.
And it's not state sanctioned, it's not ceremonial dress, it's not...
Yeah. yeah, yeah. I'm also reminded of Joseph Jacobs saying that everyone is the folk. We're all folk. In some sense, any item of clothing that is human-made, could potentially gain access, but with that additional idea of it being, sort of non-official, not your professional job, not mass-produced, kind of unique, distinctive, all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So coming here to London and the East Bank, you've added more materials specifically for this exhibition to reflect its new location, to reflect our East Londonness. Could you say a bit about how the exhibition coming here has become more London?
This exhibition and the previous exhibition, which was mounted at Compton Verney, were funded by NHLF, and they were both really just setting out to be a snapshot of UK folk practice. It's impossible to try and embrace and show everything. It's too vast. There are over 700 seasonal customs and events that happen in the UK. So it was literally meant to be a little snapshot of what's happening. And this exhibition has more of a London focus. So we've got things like the Doggett's Coat and Badge race outfit, which is the oldest rowing race in the world, established in 1715 originally. And Doggett was I only found this out today, actually, was a theatre producer. And he allegedly fell out of a barge crossing the Thames and was rescued by one of the watermen and set up like a bequest so that each year the watermen would have this race and be honoured if they won with the costume and the silver badge, which is on the arm, which depicts the house of a horse from the House of Hanover and the word liberty. So we have things like that. We've got an increased Pearly presence, the Pearly Kings and Queens, which I'm sure most people here probably know of. Henry Croft was a costermonger. Amy, do you remember the date? Henry? It's Victorian, 1880s. And Henry was a costermonger, and he used to collect buttons, pearl shell buttons, and decorate his working clothes, basically. And the expression Flash Harry comes from Henry Croft because the flash, which is a line of pearls along the side of the trouser, comes from Henry Croft. So we have more of a Pearly presence. Doreen Golding, who's the only Pearly in London area, who has two titles, the Pearly Queen of Bow Bells and the Pearly Queen of the Old Kent Road. So we have more Pearlies, we have the Swan Upping, and of course we have far more Carnival represented. So I was at college with a guy called Clary Sanderby, who's set up a company called Mahogany, and they produce carnival costumes for Notting Hill. And the Windrush costume, which is the first thing you see when you come in, is by Clary. So yeah, there's much more of a London focus.
Brilliant. Talking of carnival, I'm quite interested in the idea of transformation. As Miriam said, my own work's on fairy tale and folk narrative and traditional storytelling. And often in traditional stories, the donning of a costume or a cloak has a slightly kind of ritualistic dimension. So kind of a mossy coat when she puts on her moss coat and runs away from home, or donkey skin are all kind of donning new uniforms. And in folk narrative, it's connected with the idea of a kind of ritual transition and change, the idea of a rite of passage, of in fairy tales in particular, associated too with the idea of growing up. Do you think something similar is happening with folk costume and with clothing in the kinds of materials you're dealing with in Carnival in particular?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. I mean, Carnival costumes are an expression of community, they're a celebration of life, they're very sexy, and they're quite political in some aspects. The Windrush costume being an example. But I think if you look at most of these seasonal customs and events, all of the costumes, to some extent, lead you into that community's set of beliefs and the things they hold dear. Hastings Jack in the Green, which is on Monday, for instance, which I'll talk about in more depth later. All of these things are transformative on one level. But we're not unique in that way. Every culture in the world uses costume as a form of transcendence, and particularly within ritual practice. So, yeah, we're not unique in that way.
Yeah, I guess the connection to fertility, right, renewal, change is all deeply embedded in this material. Yeah. Yeah. So looking at the exhibition, I went around again today, I'm really struck by the sense it gives of the mutability of the folk traditions you're dealing with, so that there's a perception that tradition is fixed and immutable, but actually what we see in the exhibition here is a story of change and the incorporation of new cultural elements, and it's kind of history in action. I was wondering if you'd agree with that, and if that was something you were aiming for in building the collection.
No, absolutely. I mean, all of these things are in a constant state of flux. I mean, you often read of people saying, oh, we need these traditions kept alive. And there's a very good reason if they die out. It's because they're no longer relevant for that community. But something else will bubble up. It's like the Bridgeport Hat Festival, which we'll come to. Things are happening all the time. People create folklore naturally all the time without even thinking about it. Yeah, it's. I've forgotten the question.
Just about sort of mutability of
the mutability.
Yes,
totally. Yeah, it's always in flux.
Change.
Yeah. So
yeah. I think it's Malinowski who says that if the folk tradition survives, it's because it's still relevant and culturally current, and if it isn't, it will die. We'll no longer have it.
But that's fine. I mean, that's absolutely fine. These things shouldn't be trapped in aspic. They should be relevant, alive, vibrant, etc. So. And Making Mischief has become Making More Mischief. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the title and why you and the curators have chosen it. Well, we have the queen of titles in the person of Melanie Robinson, who's not here this evening, but she's the project manager for the museum. Melanie's worked with me for about just over 10 years, I think now, and she's great at coming up with titles. And when we were talking about this exhibition, the one thing that often weaves itself through a lot of these traditions is mischief. They're rowdy, they're drunken, they're quite anarchic quite often. They're often suppressed by the authorities. So Making Mischief seemed to be the perfect title. And you've got things like Mischief Night, which is quite popular up in the north, not so much down the south, where people back in the day would smear treacle on people's doorknobs or take their gates off and put them on the top of the barn. Or if you live in Merseyside now, it's usually an arson attack, which is like they're hardcore up there. So Mischief Night is still popular. And so Making More Mischief seemed to be the perfect title.
Yeah, so we're connected to the idea of the trickster and trickster traditions and sort of troublemaking, disrupting, but hopefully not through arson.
Well, not here, hopefully. Yeah.
Tell us about a couple of the pieces. What's your favourite piece that people should go and look at afterwards, and why? What's the story of it?
That's easy. Yeah. That's easy. So 30 years ago, I was invited to go along to the Jack in the Green Festival in Hastings. Now, Jack in the Green, back in the day, I think the first reports of Jack in the Green are from around 1770, 1780, and it was when milkmaids would process. It was a processional event that happened on May Day, and they would canter down the street with silver plate on their head, balanced on their head. And it was a kind of form of legalised begging. And a little later on, chimney sweeps became involved. During the summer months, they weren't cleaning chimneys, so they needed some money, and they would often make a garland, and the garland would get bigger, is the way with boys. My garland's bigger than your garland, and this thing eventually ended up encasing the figure, and it became known as the Jack. And the Jack in the Green is a classic example of a folk tradition that was suppressed and has re-emerged because it's found relevance again. In 1983, Keith Leach, who's a folklorist in Hastings, found these reports of Jack in the Green and thought, oh, that would be interesting to re-establish. And I don't know if you've ever been to Hastings. They love dressing up. They dress up at any excuse. They've got Krampus night. They've got all sorts of different things that involve dressing up. And when I first went 30 years ago, there were probably a couple of hundred people lining the streets to watch. And now I think last year was 27,000. So it's an indication of the increase and the need for ritual events. And Hastings Jack in the Green is a very good example on one level. Oh, yes, so the answer to that question was, so my Jack in the Green costume, which is in the other room, in the main the costume gallery, is actually based on the cut of a 1770s frock coat. It's sort of a man's silhouette from that period. And I worked with Christopher Kelly. He's a tutor here, I believe. And he constructed the costume. And the horns are a kind of symbol of power. They always have been, and fertility. So it kind of echoes the history of Jack in the Green, and it's my favourite costume.
And it's the one with the green sort of strips of cloth?
No, it's like a tapestry frock coat. As you come in, it's the first on the left.
We'll go and find it afterwards.
Yeah.
And this is my favourite story in your collection, actually. It's the story about the Bridgeport hats and how you obtained them. Could you tell us that?
So in 2010, Roger Snook had a hat shop in Bridport, and he thought, wouldn't it be good if we had a festival donated to the Tipfer, to hats? And he basically established this parade of hat-wearing people, and that it's still going strong. In fact, it's even bigger than it ever was. And a friend of mine who I work with called Tim Walker, who's a photographer, his assistant James was at a car boot sale in Bridport, and there are all these extraordinary, bizarre-looking homemade hats that don't look like anything I've ever seen before. And they'd been thrown out because the woman who'd made them had died, and her relatives had no idea what these things were, and said, let's just get rid of those then. So we were able to James rescued them and rang me up and said, oh, you'll never guess what I've got for you. And they're in the gallery.
But these are years and years of hats that were just being thrown out in a car boot sale.
Yeah. But again, it's the way in which, having established the museum project, we find all the time that so many things like this have been overlooked or undervalued or not seen as being worth keeping. So it's a very good example of what we're actually about.
Yeah, I think that's why I like the story, because it says something really important about the nature of the material you're collecting and why, and the fact that it to many it would feel quite ephemeral and something that you'd throw out. Yeah. But actually, the right person with the right eye will spot it and rescue it. And that says something about the kind of chance by which these materials are preserved and presented in the museum. And it's similar with storytelling as well. You know, some stories survive by chance because someone happened to write them down at a certain moment. Many others are lost to history, and that's just the nature of the material you're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I tell you about my favourite object?
Do please. A drink. It's
the Kate Greenaway May Queen dress. One, because it's a really lovely object, but two, because Kate Greenaway was also, as you know, an illustrator of children's books, and actually she was one of the really pioneering illustrators of children's books. One as the kind of first sort of female illustrator to really achieve the kind of level of recognition. The other reason being that she was amongst the first illustrators to start working with Edmund Evans, the printer who began to use sort of colour woodblocks in a way that that enabled sort of printing for children's books to happen on a really significant scale. So she was one of the first of that generation of what's sometimes called the golden age of illustration, including sort of Richard Doyle and Walter Crane, who really revolutionised children's book printing and illustrating, and specifically fairy tale illustrations. But I like that for all of those artists in that kind of movement, and they were associated with the arts and crafts movement, were also involved in many different media simultaneously. So you've got William Morris doing sort of wallpaper and writing as well. Crane also was involved in making sort of clothing and banners, as well as illustrating and writing children's books. And the dress shows that Greenaway was doing that as well, making clothes at the same time as she was really transforming children's books. And for her as well, her father was an engraver, her mother was a dressmaker, so she's kind of bringing together both of those elements of her own background. But I also really like the connection to Walter Crane, who was very interested in May Day, both as a socialist who was interested in the political dimensions of the day, but then also someone who's interested in folk and fairy tale, and he kind of brings those two things together. So yeah, I really love that piece because of all of those resonant connections it has. Yeah. So what's next for the Museum of British Folklore?
Oh gosh, what's next? So we are currently involved with a project with Wessex Museums. There's Paul, Dorset, Wiltshire, Swindon, and the other one, Amy. Paul, yes. And they have come to us to ask if we could collate the folk material within each of the museums to put together a touring show. So it's a 2-year project, and we've just kind of finished I'm working with Amy and Melanie, and we've just finished the research stage, and then I'll be designing it as well for each of the venues. So we're involved with that. My other hat is the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Cornwall. Has anyone been? Yay! Great. So that takes up quite a lot of time because we are involved with a lot of changes there. And we're looking at ways that both museums can help each other potentially in the future. So that's at early stages, but that's what we're doing at the moment, I think.
Great, thank you. I'll ask a couple of questions about May Day, and then we can throw it open to the audience for questions. But tell us a bit about the significance of May Day in folk terms.
So May Day, as we know it in Europe, we think is sort of stems from the Roman festival of Flora. Flora was a goddess of flowers. And it's about the beginning of summer. So across Europe, there are a lot of festivals which honour that, usually using greenery being brought into the house. The Celtic countries like Ireland and Scotland, it's called Beltane, and there are various things where you wake up in the early morning to see the dawn, wash your face in dew to ensure internal beauty. So there's a lot of folklore around May Day. The holiday was actually it's May Day bank holiday is always on the Monday, not on May Day itself. But so yeah, May Day was often associated with the beginning of summer, really, for the most part. It's only later that the Labour Day comes into play, and International Workers' Day. But yeah.
Yeah, but it's not just about maypoles. Obviously, maypoles are important.
Not just about maypoles. Yeah. There's a lot of myths about maypoles.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were basically a means of erecting something to dance around as opposed to phallic symbols. The Wicker Man's got a lot to answer for, basically. We can get onto that later. But yeah.
I'll come on to the Wicker Man. Yeah. So there has been a big revival recently in sort of folk horror films, which perhaps emphasise the scarier dimensions of folk rituals and fertility rites and things associated with with May Day. And I'm thinking of films like Men and Ennis Men and Midsummer, all of which kind of refer back to that great sort of the grandfather of folk horror, which is The Wicker Man. So is there also something a bit frightening and disturbing about all this? And what's that scary dimension for? What does that come from?
Well, I mean, there are elements of sacrifice within some folk traditions. You've got the burning of the bartle that happens, where a sort of stuffed figure that looks like a Guy Fawkes figure made out of old clothes, stuffed, gets carried through the village, and anyone who's had any bad luck that year touches that figure to transfer their bad luck away, and then it gets burnt. You've got the hunting of the Earl of Roane, where he's led backwards through the town on a donkey and is shot throughout the day and then falls to the floor only to be resurrected. But he ends up being thrown into the sea and stoned to death. So there's quite a lot of the dark side of folk practice. So it's not surprising in a way that that writers and popular culture have picked up on that side of thing. But you know, and it also deals with isolated communities, quite often practicing things that are very particular to them, but not necessarily to outsiders. You have that aspect. There's quite a lot of material, I think, if you wanted to delve into it.
I guess it's also got that sort of ritual dimension to it, hasn't it? And there's the kind of the idea of death of the old in order to make the new is also really embedded in these rituals. So it's got that sense of change, and the kind of scariness of that change is part of those traditions.
Yeah, but it's a group of people doing something that you're not familiar with that could potentially threaten you, that they've picked up on, which isn't particularly true. But I think James Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough, and Margaret Murray, for instance, both anthropologists who wrote books in the late 1800s. When was Golden Bough?
Golden Bough, 1880?
1880. Yeah. And they had an enormous influence, way beyond their source material, but they've since been proven to be pretty sketchy in terms of research. But the influence they had on the writers of The Wicker Man was quite profound. So, and they posited this idea that there was an early pagan religion of sorts. Particularly Margaret Murray was very interested in the witch cult. But again, it's all pretty spurious when it's picked apart.
Yeah. I think that was approval.
True or not?
Yeah, thank you, Simon.
We've mentioned the political associations of May Day, and it is sometimes called Labour Day. It's International Workers' Day. And simultaneously, it's got these folk associations, and they're not connected, but it's an interesting sort of simultaneity.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you thought there is a connection that we can see in the kind of things you're doing in the exhibition. Is there anything of that political dimension in the collection you're making?
I don't think in this exhibition particularly, because the connection to May Day, as I've just described, and International Labour Day, they're very, very different beasts. I was surprised at how many countries have the International Workers' Day. I mean, it's massively widespread. I had no idea. In Africa alone, I'll just read this. Algeria, Angola, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Libya, Mauritius, Morocco, Mozambique, Namibia. I can't say it because I've had some champagne.
Namibia.
Yes. Nigeria, Somalia, South Africa, Tanzania, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. They all have May Day. They all celebrate May Day as a holiday, and it's across the board. A lot of communist countries also. But the connections to the May Day that I described earlier, with the fertility and is not. It's different.
Yeah. I was just thinking maybe of the kind of the class dimensions of the material you're collecting, the fact that it's not official art, so it's maybe got
It's vernacular.
It's got an anti-authoritarian dimension. It just seemed like a nice kind of chance meeting of things.
No, I think there's it's not for no reason at all that those two things happen at the same time.
Yeah, and Walter Crane, in fact, makes I printed out one of his images earlier. I haven't got it with me, but he does the workers' maypole, right. Which shows it's a kind of a International Workers' Day poster, but it's also got a maypole, and each of the strands of the maypole have things like kind of 8-hour day and
right.
and full adult suffrage and things like that. So the creative artists of that period have made that connection.
Yeah.
So what's happening on May Day? What should we look out for?
Oh, where to start? I tried to make a brief list, but there are so many things across the UK that happen on May Day. Everyone's welcome to come to Hastings on Monday, of course, where I will be painted green, tripping around the street. But there are so many different towns and villages that celebrate May Day to some extent. Padstow, of course, where there are two osses. They're these sort of cantering figures that represent horses that nobody knows the origin of, but it's the oldest known fertility sort of festival that happens in the UK, and it's a kind of riotous. It starts off the night before, where there's it's totally the opposite. The groups of performers go around and sing the night song outside various houses, and it's a very, very moving, touching song about the change of seasons. And then the daytime is far more riotous and raucous, and you've got Jack in the Green now happening in Oxford and so many places that I can't remember. I've got a memory like a sieve, I'm sorry. But where else? Ask me afterwards. Whitstable, Kingsbury, Durham, Oxford, Rochester. I mean, you've got the May Day motorbike race that comes from London to Hastings. There's lots and lots and lots of things that happen.
I should also do a shout out for our May Day rave, which is happening on Thursday, with lots of fantastic events, including NUMBY Arts' May Queen procession, which is at 7:30 on Tuesday. 7 p.m. on Thursday, which is going to be brilliant. Great. So I think, have we got some time to take some questions from the floor? So we've got a roving mic, which Mirren has. Or shout. Yeah.
Simon, are you no longer in the caravan, are you?
No, the caravan was literally just for 2009. Poor thing, her undercarriage is gone. It happens to us all. And she's in dry dock at the moment in a warehouse.
Does the museum have a venue now?
Nope. That's what we're aiming towards, is a permanent venue. The collection is currently in store in Launceston, in Cornwall. But we're still planning other events and other exhibitions. And the Wessex exhibition will actually have quite a lot of pieces from the museum's archive.
Hi, Simon.
Hello.
In any way optimistic that the UK agreeing to ratify the ICH UNESCO Treaty for Intangible Cultural Heritage? Are you in any way optimistic that this will have any effect whatsoever in supporting folklore from Woodstock?
Honest answer? Probably not. It's a government sanction. I mean, if they could really pull their finger out, they should have done it years ago. Do you remember that it was a Conservative, of course, MP who was asked if the UK had any folk culture, and he said, not that I know of. And so I'm not sure by joining, I mean, the good thing would be if insurance was insured for events and they were allowed to continue in a way that at the moment, like Hastings Jack in the Green has just had all its funding cut. So they can't actually legally perform next year. So we're hoping that by signing up to the UNESCO Treaties for Intangible Heritage, that could have a positive effect, but I'm not holding my breath.
Because when you said about, sorry to piggyback when you said about traditions dying out, I think, well, the opposite of that is the fact that cheese rolling, there is no official committee for cheese rolling because they're too terrified. Minehead, when they had the unfortunate accident at Minehead and the lady got killed.
That was Padstow.
Apologies, Pasco. Anyway, the coroner's report said that because there was no one responsible, this sort of thing could happen again. But because people are so scared to put an event, it's almost as if we have an undercover organising committee now. And I like this, you talk to fairground people, and their traditional fairgrounds, they can't go to them anymore. And a lot of it is about insurance. It's like, it's not official censorship, but it's like the pressure of insurance and running a public event properly is affecting either how above board events are or whether people choose to put on events at all.
Yeah.
Which is not the same thing as the community not wanting to support it, but I just think it would be nice if more of us were aware of this red tape.
Yeah, no, I think they are within the local communities. I mean, if you talk to the people who organise the barrel burning in Ottery St Mary, which is incredibly dangerous. Has anyone been to Ottery? Duck is all I can say. When I first went, there was, I wasn't kind of quite prepared, but it starts off with children, young little children, with burning barrels on their backs, running down the high street, passing this barrel to the next person. And I remember all his hair was scorched off the side of his head. And the parents were like, yes! And any other community, he'd be rushed to A&E, but not in Ottery. And I'm amazed that event still happens because of exactly those reasons. How do you possibly insure against something happening when you've got barrels, enormous barrels, 2-meter wide barrels being run into crowds of people with tar and pitch? It's fabulous. But yeah, sorry, I've forgotten. Yes, is that a long-winded answer? It's sort of. Yes, okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
My hometown is Poole in Dorset, where we still celebrate beating the bounds every year, and I'm struck that beating the bounds is in fact rushing around the boundaries of the town and the arbour and whacking small boys with canes.
They deserve it.
There's an awful lot of violence going on. Is it a kind of healthy violence, and should we embrace it, or should we be worried by that?
The last time I was in Poole and witnessed it, it's very tippy-tappy. They don't bleed. It's pretty lightweight, and they also beat the bounds in the sea, which is very interesting too. Beating the bounds is something. It happens in London, in fact, still. But it was a means of impressing on the minds of the young the boundaries of areas, villages, towns, whatever it was, and they carry sticks and they beat the bounds. And it's no longer. It doesn't mean anything anymore, other than being like a ritual practice. But yeah, they're not really beaten very hard, so I wouldn't worry about it.
I think we're getting to the bottom of why folk culture is scary, though.
Yes, could be. Yeah.
It always makes the local press the fact that they do it in a boat.
Yes.
In the harbour. So the mayor, in all his outfit and the whole lot, get in a boat, go off and beat the bounds in a boat.
Yeah.
That makes the local news.
Yeah. We're actually featuring that in the Wessex music exhibition. Yeah.
Just to say that there's a wonderful folk festival that lasts a week in Broadstairs in Kent. There's lots and lots of there's lots and lots of Morris men and lots of Morris girls and female only Morris ladies, and it's just a wonderful festival. And just the other day, I wandered into a toy shop actually, and I bought this little camera. Viewfinder with a fairy tale, like the Grimm's, and there's Hansel and Gretel. And when I googled, as you do, Google
Andrew, you probably know about that.
Yeah. There's a great book by Maria Tatar on the Grimm tales, in which she writes quite a lot about the association of these stories with sort of periods of famine and the things people resorted to, and some of the stories can be regarded as a kind of folk memory or stories related to that kind of those historical moments.
Is this on? Yes. Oh, good. A couple of comments which I'd really be interested to hear your response to, really. One is the thought that certainly the experience of organised religion, Christianity coming not from the Celtic side, but actually from other influences, ultimately put a stop to a huge amount of folk expression. And it happened gradually over time, but that was a serious blow. And secondly, I've forgotten what secondly is now. Well, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I mean, we don't know what they were doing before Christianity came along. It's like a lot of things the Wicker Man is often, it's all pagan. It's actually nonsense. It's not. It was all often 17th, 18th century. A lot of these traditions developed. They might have echoes of something older, but we don't know what pagans were practicing exactly. So a lot of it's projection to some extent. So we don't know. You mentioned that the church put stop to, but we don't know what those things were particularly.
No, we don't. We certainly know that they had folk traditions which the Celtic Christians encouraged, and it was all alongside. It was all intertwined, and that as they got more and more organised, they put a stop to all that other stuff.
Or adopted things.
Well, no, they adapted things.
Okay.
They put their celebrations to coincide with pagan celebrations so that they could stop the pagans doing what they wanted to do and make them go to church instead. I'll shut up.
You've read Margaret Murray, haven't you?
Hi, just a sort of comment and then a question after it. A few of us here are from Ossory St Mary, so I've been to tar barrels more times than I can remember. And I think the way they can still do it is they use an insurance company in New Zealand.
Oh, really?
Who might not have access to the internet, so maybe don't understand what they're funding. But I know a few years ago, someone threw a can of deodorant into a barrel and it exploded in someone's face. And the guy whose face was really badly damaged from it didn't claim a life-changing amount of money on insurance because he cared about the tradition of it. So I guess going back to thinking about how communities can sort of save these traditions, for want of a better phrase. But I wondered whether you could comment a bit on social media. I know it's not necessarily folklore, but the Christmas carols in Columbia Road this year went viral on TikTok and they had to stop doing it because everyone was going. So where do you draw the line between inviting people to celebrate something but also trying to keep it to the community in which it's emerged from?
It's very difficult, basically. I mean, if Jack in the Green, to come back to that because I know it quite well, is a very good example. A couple of years ago, a young lad climbed up a lamp, a street light, and fell off and broke his leg. And so these things, by their very nature, are often, we mentioned the sort of anarchic side of these festivals and traditions. It's a means for a community to let off steam. I mean, if you've ever been to the Haxey Hood in Haxey, it's two teams from opposing villages who wrestle for a rolled piece of leather to get it into the opposing team's pub. And it gets quite brutal. So a lot of these traditions, that's the nature of them. And it's like somebody mentioned the cheese rolling earlier. The cheese rolling was banned, I think, a couple of years ago, and they got up at 5 a.m. and did it anyway. It's like you can't suppress these things; they'll only bubble up in some other form. I went to Stonehaven up in Scotland, where they do the hurling of the fireballs, which is basically a ball of inflammable stuff, rags and whatever, dipped in petrol on the end of a chain, and they run through the streets twirling them. And the first year I went, the local children were played dare to run between the legs of the hurlers. It's all fenced off now. It's so anemic and kind of... but yeah, it will reoccur in some other way, I hope. Give me the danger. I mean, it's what we're here for, isn't it? And I don't want to be anaesthetised to all this stuff. It's part of being human.
One more.
The other thing I was going to ask was about, do you feel that what's happening in music festivals in terms of dressing up and, is evidence of young people grabbing the opportunities that they can get hold of to have this same expression?
There's a folkloric element to festivals, but I wouldn't put them in my calendar of folklore events because they're an organised thing that people pay for, and it's a very different structure. It's not a community coming together. It's usually a group of people who are making money from the event. But there's a folkloric element to it, I suppose. Has anyone been to Burning Man? Burning Man hits both things. It's quite folkloric in many ways, but it's also commercial on another. But yeah, festivals, don't know.
One more?
Hello.
Yeah.
Do I need to press it?
Shout.
Yeah. Hello. I feel like I've got so much to say based on what the lady behind me was saying, but personally, I believe that it's in the human spirit to want to celebrate, have fun, come together. We're social beings. We're born helpless. We need, other people so that we can survive on our own. And I personally feel that we live in a very individualistic society, and I kind of see folk traditions and culture and rituals and all that as a pathway to dismantle some of the ways that our society is right now. I'm just curious to hear from you how you see folklore, folk traditions becoming more relevant in mainstream society. And I mean, I kind of feel like there's possibly a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? This kind of belief that folk culture is weird or quirky, which I personally think is a good thing. Well, that's what I like about it. But kind of off of what the lady was saying about how, because I kind of agree that festivals could be an example of how humans, use celebration through music and dance to have fun, basically. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. On just like how you see folk lore and folk traditions becoming more relevant in mainstream society and less of this niche, quirky, weird thing where you need to get special insurance and all that stuff that you were talking about earlier. The relevance is to the communities who are celebrating the things. They beyond that community, I'm not sure how relevant they would be to another, because each community has their own form of expression. So you can't kind of generalize that and say, it's a tricky one. Do you know what I mean? It's very community based. All the things that you're looking up here, most of them, are very community based and very particular, but they share. There's a commonality to them. They're all about people coming together. If you see the film running down the Arkanola film downstairs, what they're saying about being an expression of their individual culture, celebration, community, all of those things apply to virtually everything that you're seeing up on the screen. It's all
it's all the same thing. So in terms of folklore being more relevant, people just do it anyway. It's only us defining it as folklore because we're curators, but people do it just naturally.
It kind of makes me think about how I would say that internet culture, meme culture could be considered folklore or folk culture.
Which folk culture?
Like meme culture and internet culture, because it is. I mean, so I'm doing research for a book I'm writing about all this, so I could go on. But my personal definition of folk is regular people, so working class people, people who are not part of the elite or ruling class, and folk culture. My personal definition of that is culture of regular people that hasn't been imposed on by, the elite and ruling class. So you could say that meme culture, internet culture is folk culture because typically it is produced and consumed by, in my definition, the folk. So yeah, I guess kind of the answer of my initial question was it's all about if community building happens and it looks like folk, it is folky, then it is folk culture. And
what do you mean if it looks folky?
As in, like, if the way that the community are gathering and holding events, if it is relating to maybe some sort of rituals or celebrations, then maybe it would be considered folk.
Yeah, if it's not state sanctioned, if it's come about through, like the Notting Hill Carnival came about because the community wanted to celebrate something. All of these events usually come about not because the state said, "Oh, you need to have this festival. We want to put this on for you." It's because they wanted to do it, however dangerous it might be or not. And that kind of defines a folk practice, if you like. It's not state sanctioned. It hasn't been put on for. It's not like the Lord Mayor's show, or they're not folk events. Folk events are the things that we've been talking about here. So,
I think we've reached our time, but it's been really fantastic hearing from you, Simon. We've got a late request.
Go on.
Okay, go on. One more.
About the crafting of some of the costumes, like the burying man and the figure with the straw around the head and then through the dress. So I just wanted to know, how do people know how to make these things? Are they passed down between families, or because some of those look ancient? You've got photos from like 1901 or something, and then you see that image appear later on. So how are those? Are they written down?
Generally, it's a practice based. So it's the children will see their parents doing it, and it's an oral tradition for the most part. You don't get a detailed description of how to dress a Buryman. It's the children will watch the Buryman being dressed and know as they grow up and get older how to do that. Same with the Whittlesea Straw Bear. The same with the Festival of the Horse pictures. You'll see those along the wall of the exhibition. All of those things are.
It died out. Doc Rowe, who's a photographer, was allowing to see the Buryman being dressed. And one year, he had to teach the locals how to dress the Buryman.
Yeah.
So it was passed from the photographer, who's Doc Rowe's quite a well-known photographer, ended up teaching the community how to dress the Buryman, because somehow that transition got lost in that community.
Yeah. It's the same way that Sir Benjamin Stone photographed several festivals that died out consequently, and people used the original pictures in order to reconstruct the event. Doc's a good mate.
I think that's the other part of the answer to the question about what constitutes the kind of what allows it to be included in your exhibition, that it has that element of anonymous transmission from generation to generation. Yeah. So it has that quality.
And the role of the
To capture and classify and record, yes. Great. thank you so much, Simon. It's been really brilliant hearing from you, and thank you for your time today. Perhaps we can end with a round of applause for Simon. And please go up and have a look at the exhibition.